Thank you so much for joining. And as people roll in, we'll just keep them updated. Thank you so much for joining the inaugural Europe Consider It All conference. We're all very happy that you're here. And I'm looking forward, and I hope you are too, to all the presentations coming up today. And just so you know, this is in cooperation with the Institute of European Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, the Center for European Studies at UNC Chapel Hill, and the Humboldt University of Berlin. Before we get started, we do just want to start by saying that our conference stands in support with Ukraine. And yesterday, UNC actually had an event with people zooming in from Kiev. And it was very moving to hear their stories and what they've been experiencing right now. And I think one message that stood out to me, especially, was their strong national identity that has always been there, but has especially been highlighted by this crisis. And a couple of the demands that they have made that I think I would just like to pass their message along, that maybe is not heard as often or is not being taken as seriously, is the no-fly zone within Ukraine that they'd like, more partnerships with Ukrainian universities inside Ukraine, and then also to donate directly to Ukrainian organizations. So Razom for Ukraine is one of them, Nova Ukraine is another, and the Ukrainian Association of North Carolina actually has a march today, which unfortunately, if you're here, you won't be able to visit it, but tomorrow they are also having a collection for medical supplies, and that's listed on their Facebook page. And we'll make sure to send these links out with our follow-up email, which I'll get to at the end of our presentation. But I also do want to highlight that while there is a lot of aid going to Ukraine, that not everyone is receiving the equal treatment that they deserve to leave Ukraine, if that's what they choose to do or need to do. Specifically, Black students who have tried to leave Ukraine either have not had the ability to leave Ukraine, or by entering other countries in Europe have been taken off trains and arrested, or not even been allowed on trains. So we just want to also highlight that, because that is an important part that does often seem to be left out of the story, and we find it to be equally as important. And now just kind of a little bit of the background of how this conference came to be. So in December 2021, there was an article in which some of my fellow conference organizers, Sarah Hutchison, Kellen Robinson, and Jalen McNeil, wrote an article about really expanding the curriculum of contemporary European studies at UNC to make it a more inclusive and accurate understanding of Europe. And they go into detail about how the center and the curriculum itself does have a lot of work to do to opening it up more to students of color, to other minority students, just to make sure that they are getting the equal support and do feel that their voices are heard without being pulled into the conversation every time. And this is just fostering a support system to make sure that they are heard in academia. And this is one of the ideas that came from that talk, that conference, that discussion. And so special thanks to Kellen, Jalen, and Sarah. I'm glad I was able to join them on this journey in organizing this conference. But that's just a little background of the conference. And here's the agenda for today. So we're doing the welcome remarks right now. After that, we're going to go through our sessions. So Germany Today, Terminology and Its Pitfalls, Under Considered Careers, Religion in Contemporary Europe, Eastern and Central Europe, Legacies of Colonialism, Identity and Humanity in Europe, and closing remarks. And during session 3, that'll be our lunchtime session. So if you want to turn your camera off, take some time to have lunch in between, that's a session that we recommend to do that in, but of course you can do that as you wish. And now we're going to go into discussion guidelines, just because some of the discussions here may get a little more sensitive, and they do talk about some very emotional topics, and we just want to make sure that we have a respectful yet constructive conversation. So the first step in our guidelines is to listen to understand and not to respond. I think today, a lot of the times when we're listening to people's arguments, it's just so that we can form a rebuttal. And we want to make sure here that we're really trying to understand someone's point of view, understand their argument, and not necessarily just try to find a way to refute it or break down the argument. And then we'd like you to step up or step back, depending on how involved you are. So step up if you feel like you have something important to say and you haven't said much and you'd like to submit a question or a comment, feel free to do so. We want to hear your opinions and your feedback, but also if you have been talking a lot, just make sure that you do leave room for others so that they can also share what they're feeling or any questions that they may have. Respect confidentiality. Of course, we don't know how personal things may get in some of these conversations, but we do want to make sure that people's personal details are not shared without this call, so they stay within this conference and that people can feel free to share their own experiences and feelings. And then speaking from your own experiences, I know it can be very easy to just generalize and say we or our when speaking about emotional experiences, but we just want to make sure that you focus on using I experiences or only talking about what you have experienced yourself. And then another one kind of has two parts to it, is assuming the best intention of everyone's statements, but also acknowledging your impact versus intent. So we want to believe that everyone's saying something out of good intentions, but also it's important to understand that just because you said something doesn't mean that it's not interpreted a certain way or it doesn't affect someone a certain way. And so we just want to be conscious of both sides of that. And then the last one is lean into your discomfort. Some of these conversations about gender identity or racial identity can be uncomfortable for some people, and that's understandable, but I think the way that we really can move forward and really grow as people and as a society is to lean into that and kind of understand why we feel that way and work to feel more and more comfortable with talking about that so we really can take that next step. Does anyone have any questions regarding that? And feel free to raise your hand or unmute if you do. If not, one thing I do want to mention is after our sessions will run this way, we'll have the moderator introduce each person and their topic briefly, and then it'll actually be all 3 or 2 papers and presenters at the beginning, and then we'll go through each presenter. And at the end of a session, we'd like to do questions. So if you do have any questions, please send them in the chat, and then our moderator will ask them for you. And yeah, if there are no questions right now, again, feel free to send them in the chat at any time, but we are going to move into our first session, Germany Today, and I will pass it on to Katie.
Thank you so much, Tracy. I don't even know how to begin to thank you. Let me just welcome everyone today on behalf of the Center for European Studies. It's really nice to see your faces and names. And I know we have to get right into it because we are lucky to have Priscilla Layne with us this morning, but not too long. So my extreme gratitude to Sarah Hutchison for all you do every day, but especially today to say thank you for supporting our students all the time and making this conference possible. Really, thank you so much. Thank you to Kellen, Tracy, and Jalen for making today happen, for all of your ideas, for your continuous communication about what you're seeing and learning, and providing us or feeling enough trust to tell us what's happening and to working with us to put this out there. We value your input so much and are so grateful for all you tell us and for letting us provide a platform for all of you. So thank you. Thanks also, Tracy already said, thanks to Berkeley and Humboldt for co-sponsoring. It's so lovely that all of you are here and are going to, and so many of you are going to put your papers forward. So I'm just going to jump right in to introduce one of my most favorite people at UNC, Dr. Priscilla Layne. She is an associate professor of German. Her research and teaching draws on post-colonial studies, gender studies, and critical race theory to address topics like representations of Blackness in literature and film, rebellion, and the concept of the other in science fiction and fantasy. In addition to her work on representations of Blackness in German culture, she has also published essays on Turkish German culture, translation, punk, and film. She's the author of White Rebels in Black, German Appropriation of African American Culture, University of Michigan Press in 2018, and her current book project is on Afro-German Afrofuturism. Priscilla, Dr. Layne, holds an adjunct appointment in African American, and Diaspora Studies at UNC. Is also very involved in the Global Cinema Program and is, this needs to be updated, is not the vice president, but is the president of the American Association of Teachers of German, the nationwide organization. And Priscilla, you are a rock star, and we are so grateful for all of the collaborations we do together. We're so happy to have you here today. And we will also, just a quick plug, next Friday at noon, we are going to have a talk with Birgit Weihe, zooming in from Germany, and Priscilla, and then a moderator coming in from Canada to talk about a graphic novel that, that Birgit Weihe wrote about Priscilla's life. So really, we'll get you more information about that. I'm just gonna turn it right over to you. Thank you for being here, Priscilla.
Yes, thank you. I'm glad I was able to join this morning. I have a cold, so I'm sorry. I'm going to sound a little stuffy, but I'm well enough to speak, so I'm happy to be here. I also want to thank Tracy, Kellen, and Jalen, and Sarah. It's great to be invited to be here. I'm so excited by all the things you're doing. It's just wonderful to see, how inspired students at UNC are, to change the conversation and do such cutting edge events. Let's see. Can you start my PowerPoint? Or do you need me to share it on my end?
Yes, give me one.
Okay. All right. So this morning, I'm going to talk to you about the Black German diaspora. So I've organized my talk around the past and the present. So to give you some information about the Black German community, how it came to be, how it came to exist, and also where things stand today. Okay. So, and I should, okay. All right, so, okay. The image that you're seeing here, I took from the Afro census. It is a study that a Black German organization, H1 Teach One, did very recently. I believe the results were published last year. So they asked people in Germany who identify as Black all kinds of questions about, safety, access to resources, et cetera, because it can be very difficult to get like concrete numbers about the Black German community. Germany doesn't collect data on the category of race the way that we do in the US. And that has to do with the German past, the Nazi past specifically, how race, the term race is connected to the Holocaust and genocide. So because the category of race is not acknowledged as a legitimate category in Germany, we don't have accurate numbers about who considers themselves Black or not. So this Afro census was an attempt to get more accurate numbers and also get a sense of what the community needs. Okay. Oh, okay. So, so when it comes to the Black diaspora in Germany, you actually have to start before the colonies in Africa. So few people realize that Germany had colonies in Africa, but they did have quite a few. And that wasn't until the late 19th century. But there were already Black people in Germany before that. So even before Germany had colonies in Africa, there were German businesses doing business. So for example, there was a company called the Brandenburg Company, which had dealings on the Gold Coast, what is currently Ghana. So there were German companies involved in the slave trade, even if there wasn't institutionalized slavery in Germany, as we know in the US. But here are just some examples of Black people who, either lived in German-speaking lands or there are representations of them in Germany. So on the left is Saint Mauritius, Saint Maurice, who was a knight who fought for the Romans, and there are conflicting accounts as to why he died, but it seems he died because he refused to execute some people who were Christian, and so because he stood up for his religious beliefs, that's why he was sanctified. So this is a statue of him that's on a church in Magdeburg in Germany. In the middle is Katharina the Moor, who is thought to be an enslaved woman who came to Germany and was a servant to someone. And Albrecht Dürer was a famous artist who sketched her. And then on the right is Anton Wilhelm Amo, who also came to Germany as an enslaved young man. He was just a child given to a rich family as a present. And they allowed him to go to university to study, and he ended up becoming a philosopher and teaching at a university before he returned to Ghana because of racism, because people were tarnished his name and were spreading rumors about him. So just three very disparate examples. Actually, I don't know if you can see this, but this book, it's called African Europeans by Olivia Hotel. She talks about Saint Maurice, for example, if you want more information about that. Okay, so here's a map of Germany's colonies in Africa. On the right, you have them listed. So there was German West Africa, and you see which current countries that consist of. German Southwest Africa, which is Namibia today. German East Africa. So Germany got into this fight for colonies relatively late compared to, say, France or England or Belgium. So that's why they had fewer colonies and smaller territory, but you still see the remnants of this colonial period in German society today, especially when it comes to anti-Black racism and beliefs about Black people. Okay, next slide. So because Germany still owned colonies during World War I, they also conscripted Black people in the colonies to fight on their side. So during World War I, this regiment of soldiers was especially well known. They were called the Ascari Soldiers from East Africa. And you still will see images like the one on the left, where you have like the German soldier leading, these East African soldiers behind. You still see monuments like this in Africa, in Germany, artwork that really conveys the sense of white supremacy and Black subordination. Another interesting thing about these soldiers is, for some Black people from the colonies, this provided a way to migrate to Germany and attempt to set up a life there. There's one man in particular, I can't remember, I have to look up his name later, but he served as a soldier when he was just a teenager. And then after the war, he went to Germany and demanded, that he get, pay for his service, and demanded that he have a right of residency in Germany. And he also acted in a few films as an extra. Another important thing about World War I is that once Germany lost its colonies, anybody who was from the colonies living in Germany lost their papers. Like they were basically undocumented, had no legal right to stay, had no affiliation with Germany. So World War I really made life very difficult for the African people who are living in Germany. Next slide. So the first German movement is considered to be these largely young men who came from the colonies to Germany to study and to work. A lot of them were from Cameroon. These were mostly people from prominent families in Africa. So These were sons and daughters of people who were leaders in Africa, who could afford to send their children. And these young people were meant to be kind of like middlemen, helping the Germans in their management of the colonies. But like I said, after World War I, they were basically stranded in Germany. It was dangerous to return during the war, and then after the war, they lost their rights. So they began organizing to try to fight for rights to work, right of residency. And so the Negro Worker is one example of this kind of political organization. A lot of these people from the colonies tended to be left-leaning, Pan-Africanist against colonialism, interested in workers' rights. So the Negro Worker was a publication out of Hamburg. So Hamburg was one of a center for the Black German community, because if you think of it as a port city, you had Black sailors coming and going, kind of like a city like Liverpool. And another thing about this image is that here you see some of these Black immigrants with their wives and children. So at the time, if a white German woman married an African man from the colonies, she lost her citizenship. And so their wives, not only were they not citizens, but neither were their wives or their children. So you see these systematic attempts to keep people from Africa, keep them from integrating into German society and becoming a part of German society. Next slide. Okay, so another important aftermath of World War I was the French occupation of the Rhineland. So the French, occupied a part of Germany that is next to France as part of the Versailles Treaty, and they used several, I think, thousands of African colonial soldiers from like Madagascar, Mozambique, Algeria, even some soldiers from Asia. Now, for the Germans refer to all of these soldiers as Black. So in this case, Black has nothing to do with where you're from or even how you look. It was just they were different. They were not German. They were not white. So they were Black. And there was this campaign that Germans started, the Black Shame on the Rhine, where they basically argued that it was, dangerous to have these Black soldiers policing white Germans, that it would, send the wrong message. It endangered the power imbalance in the colonies because, for centuries, white Europeans had been saying that they're superior, that they have a right to rule over Black people. But here it's inverted because the soldiers are Black. They also suggested that the Black soldiers would, pose a threat to white German women, pose the threat of rape. So on the left, you see this poster. It says, protests of German women against the colored occupation on the Rhine. So you see the way the soldiers depicted, it's very racist, a caricature, a lot of the kind of details that you might associate with blackface, and the way that the landscape is depicted in the background, the hills, it almost as if it's a white woman, her breasts, and he's sitting on top of the country and on top of the woman. So there you really have a sense of what their thoughts about Black men were at this time. But the photo on the right shows that a lot of these men, had relationships with these women, were friends with them, dated them. So it wasn't the case that any fraternization was forced, as they suggested. And as a result, about 500 Black German children were born at this period from these unions. So, and that brings us to the next image. So these are some of the children born during this period in the Rhineland. At the time, already, so during Weimar Germany, before Hitler even came to power, the politicians discussed forcibly sterilizing these children because they basically didn't want them to have children, and therefore to keep changing the racial makeup of the population, because Germany understood itself as white, and therefore for them these children were a threat. They made all kinds of claims about them that Black children were, you know, especially like aggressive and large. Like the photo in the middle is meant to like say something about the Black child being inherently different from the white child. But you know, the other side of the story is that for a lot of these young people, they grew up fairly isolated in small towns where there weren't any other Black people. And you do see them living fairly normal lives, going to school, starting a job, which all changes when Hitler comes to power and he targets them specifically. So next slide. So there were Black Germans alive during the Third Reich. Black Germans were maybe not as systematically targeted as German Jews were. The fate of a Black German during this time really depended on the local politics. So there were some Black Germans who lived in a city like Hamburg. A couple lived in Hamburg where people were more used to having Black people around, and they weren't like as people didn't necessarily try to remove them from society, send them to a concentration camp, but others did get sent to camps. You see this image on the far left of a Black man in a camp. Some were forcibly sterilized. So Hans Hauch, who's in this picture wearing the military uniform, he was drafted into the military, but also forcibly sterilized, so he couldn't have children. So it shows how it's not easy to talk about the treatment of Black people during this time because it wasn't uniform. And even if they had certain privileges or rights, other times they were dehumanized, you know, mistreated, put in concentration camps, killed, etc. So, okay, next slide. So there, quite a few people did survive this period. And these are some individuals who are more well-known, and you can find their autobiography. So Hans-Jürgen Massaquoi was the first out of this group to write his autobiography, Destined to Witness, which talks all about this period. It's a really great read. And he actually ended up emigrating after the war, emigrating to the US, and he joined the US military and fought in the Korean War, and that's how he got American citizenship. And he ended up moving to Chicago and becoming the editor of, I think, Jet magazine, Ebony and Jet. So his life is super fascinating. And the other individual, so Theodor Vonya Michael, he was a little older. When he was young, he would perform in these, they were called Africa shows. Basically his dad and his siblings, they would perform Africanness or foreignness for white Germans. And that's largely how he got by during the war. Marie Maillard, she acted in films. So there were these Nazi propaganda films about Africa at the time because the Nazis wanted to recover these colonies. So that's what she did initially. And then she was made to work in a factory, do forced labor before the war ended. And then finally there's Fazia Janssen, who had been a dancer, a ballerina, until Hitler came to power and he passed, you know, the Nuremberg laws that said that non-Aryans can't be a part of the artistry. So she was, you know, thrown out of school. But eventually in the post-war period, she became a musician and actually a very influential peace activist. So a lot of like anti-nuclear war, you know, environmental rights, etc. She was very important in that movement. So the next slide. So almost done with the history here. So another important moment within the Black German community is the occupation of Germany after World War II. So at this point, Germany was split up into 4 zones. You had the American zone in the south, the British zone in the north, the French zone in the west, and the Soviet zone in the east. And there were a lot of African-American soldiers who served in the American zone. They actually would often request Germany as a place to be stationed because, you know, a lot of people are surprised to hear this, but at the time, African-American soldiers thought that Germany was kind of a relief after being in the US, in the South, going to boot camp in the South, because at the time, Jim Crow was still the law in the South. And often Black soldiers, even if they came from the North, would be sent to boot camp in the South because the army wanted to like break them and like get them used to racism and serving under a white leader. So when they got to Germany, because Germany didn't have Jim Crow laws, and they were able to say, be friends with white women and date white women without the fear of lynching, of public violent repercussions, they refer to Germany as a racial utopia, or free of racism. Now that, of course, is a more simplified view of things. There was still racism in Germany. It just wasn't the kind of, I guess, legalized racism that we had in the States. So on the left, you have this image of Black soldiers with their German girlfriends. And so because of the fraternization between Black soldiers and white German women, another about 5,000 Black German children were born at this time. On the right, you see, this is a poster of a film that's talking about one of these children named Toxie. And these children, unfortunately, their fate wasn't much better than the children who were born after World War I. They were referred to as occupation children. The German government tried to have them adopted and sent away, adopted by African-American families and sent to the US. The argument was basically that Germany had only recently overcome fascism, and so German society wasn't ready to have this population of Black children. And there were also some really ridiculous arguments saying that like they inherently couldn't deal with the climate in Germany. So you can see a lot of continuations from the Nazi period to the post-war period of just misconceptions about race and Blackness. Nevertheless, a significant amount of these children did remain in Germany. A lot of them were removed from their homes and grew up in orphanages, but still by the 60s and 70s, you had a community of Black German adults who were coming into their, political consciousness and looking to make changes. So the 80s were a really important time for the Black German community. A lot of the activism that happened in the 80s is connected to the feminist movement. So you had women like Ike Hugo Marshall's one woman who was from Munich, women who were involved in the German feminist movement of the 70s, and for fighting for women's rights. And then they realized that when they would bring up race among their, white feminist friends, the white feminists didn't want to talk about race or didn't think it mattered, didn't think it was as important as gender. So then they realized there's a need for Black feminism, for intersectional feminism. And luckily at this time, Audre Lorde was very active in Europe and interested in promoting, transnational feminism. So Audre Lorde came to Berlin in 1984 and taught several classes on poetry at Free University in Berlin, and several Black German women took her course and were able to meet each other. And she, inspired them to speak up, to write their stories of what it's like being Black in Germany. And that's where this book, Showing Our Colors, came from. So that's why she was so influential in kind of motivating these women to start founding organizations, founding newspapers and magazines about their experience and demanding more representation. And this is also when they started calling themselves Afro-German or Black German and rejecting any negative racist words that white Germans had used for them. So the next couple of slides, I just want to introduce you to some of the Black Germans today. So you see what a vibrant, diverse community it is, and a community that's well aware of its past, but is still trying to make change today and ensure that the future is a better future for Black Germans. So Sharon Dodu is actually from the UK. So she's Black British of Ghanaian descent, but she emigrated to Germany in her 20s, I believe, and has been writing in German and English and has several really great books. And then Olivia Wenzel is from East Germany. She recently published her first novel. She's also written several plays. And I actually just translated her novel into English. It'll be out in June, I think, which I highly recommend. The novel opens with her being at UNC and talking about Silent Sam and like going to Durham and going to Dane's Chicken and Waffles because I invited her to visit. So I was really excited to see she wrote up about that. So that's a great book. It's all about identity and race and, and mobility. Philip Cabo Kupsel is a slam poet, does spoken word, also writes and publishes poetry. He's South African and German. And then Michael Gutting has a very interesting story. His parents are both African American from North Carolina, but his mother was in the Air Force and didn't know she was pregnant, had him in Germany, and he was adopted by a white German couple, grew up in Germany, and then as an adult found his mother, so he comes back to Greensboro all the time. So it's just an interesting way that you realize that there are like Black Germans all around us, in our society. We just don't know their stories. Let's see, next slide. So then, of course, there are Black German musicians. Hip hop has been very influential in the community. It got to Germany by way of American soldiers serving in Germany in the 80s who would bring their records for Black German youth and also other children with, immigrant children, so Turkish German, Arab German. It was just exciting to find this art form that was all about like expressing yourself and being an individual and kind of rejecting, traditional stale culture and, demanding rights and recognition. So this is just an example of all the different varieties. So like, I think Lizzie is a German Nigerian, and she uses like kind of Black exploitation 70s elements in her music. Let's see, D Brothers Keepers. This was kind of a super group where a bunch of different Black German artists who were already famous came together to release a song addressing racist violence in Germany. Advanced Chemistry was one of the first groups to rap in German, because initially the German rap groups would rap in English because they thought it was more authentic. And they said, no, we're rapping in German and we're going to talk about politics. So they released a song, Stranger in My Own Country, where they talked about what it's like to be Black in Germany and be constantly questioned about, where you're from. Okay, next slide. So, I was going to play you an example of this song, but I realized I think it's not in, I don't have the link to the music, but I can maybe play it later. Anyway, this is an example of there it is. Can you try clicking on the speaker and see if the music will play? Okay, that's all right. So this is a song that they released. Adriano was a Black immigrant who was attacked by neo-Nazis and beaten to death. And this was around 1990 when East and West Germany reunited, and there was this surge of racist violence at the time, surge of nationalism and racism. And they released this song saying that, we're Black Germans, we're here, like, we're not going to sit quietly while all this is happening. We're not only going to speak up, but we're going to fight back. And this was a really important song for that reason. Go to the next slide. I just want to point out that one thing I find interesting about the song is that they also quote a very famous German Jewish poet, Heinrich Heine, who wrote this poem, Nachtgedanken, where he is in exile in France because he had to go to France because he wrote a lot of political poetry against the government and they were trying to put him in jail. So he's writing this poem in France about how he misses Germany and he wishes he could go back. And so I thought it was really cool that, not only are they talking about their positionality as Black Germans in the 1990s, but they're reaching back, into German literary history and connecting to this German Jewish author. So kind of showing like they're into hip hop, which is, global from the US, but they're also part of a German literary canon. And I think that that really exemplifies how a lot of Black German artists create their artwork. Okay, so the next slide. So here's some Black German directors. Interestingly, a lot of them are women. I don't know why that is, but it just so happens that a lot of Black German women and women, Black women from abroad have gone to film school in Germany. So yeah, this is The Education of Obama is a great documentary about Obama's half sister from Kenya who studied in Germany, went to film school in Germany. And so she talks all about that experience. This film at the very bottom, Precious Ivy, I just watched recently. It just came out last year. It's about two Black German half sisters who don't know about each other's existence and then meet each other after their father passes away. And this film in the middle, At Second Sight, is actually it's about race, it's about sexuality, it's about gender, it's also about disability. So there are these like three sets of couples, and in each instance, there's someone who actually has lost their eyesight or is losing their eyesight. So it's all revolves around seeing and what can and can't be seen. So anyway, just some examples of some of the topics that Black German directors address in their films. Next slide. And then Black Germans have been increasingly active in the theater. This theater, Ballhaus Nannystrasse, which is in Kreuzberg, a neighborhood that's known for having a lot of Turkish Germans and just being very multicultural in general. So the theater used to have mostly productions about Turkish Germans. Now Wagner Carvalho is the director. He's a Black German of Brazilian descent, and he's been putting on a lot of plays about colonialism. The bottom two are Afrofuturist plays. So it's just another interesting place to learn more about contemporary Black German culture. Let's see, there might be, okay, I think this is the last or the second to last. Here are some examples of Black Germans in politics. This is becoming increasingly the case that Black Germans have been more represented in politics, and you'll see they're from all kinds of parties: the Green Party, the Social Democratic Party, the Christian Democratic Party. So it's not the case that Black Germans have one political affiliation. Okay, and next slide. Oh, okay. And so these were just some Black Germans that I thought you may possibly know, because I remember, so like Milli Vanilli or Lou Bega, when I heard their music, I had no idea they were Black German. I only found out later. Zazie Bates, who's in Atlanta, along with Donald Glover. I watched that show for 2 seasons and had no idea she was Black German. And then Florence Kasumba, who's one of the female fighters in Black Panther. So just to tell you that, you might already know some famous Black Germans and just not be aware of it. Let's see. So, and finally, yeah, these are just some organizations that exist that they started forming in the 80s. Adefras for Black German women. Each One Teach One is the organization that did the census. They have a library and they do all kinds of events. And Initiative Orijalo is an example of activism for Orijalo was a man who was killed by police, and they're trying to seek justice for him. So, okay, that was it. Oh, and I think I'm at 30 minutes, just about. That's pretty good timing. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Priscilla. This is just wonderful. It's always great to hear you speak, but for today, the way that you set this context, right, that this is not something that's new, that people who look different, this idea in what we hear in the news about 2015 brought all these different people to Germany. This is not the case. This has been going on for a long time, and the way that you paint this picture is really, really wonderful. I just have 2 quick anecdotes, and then I know I have to move on. But this idea of what it means to be a foreigner in Germany, and as you, and also, for me, having lived there a long time, you bring up so many points that are not always apparent in daily life, right? And so in any case, I was visiting my cousins in southern Germany, and they had a little friend over. They were about 6, And their family was Franco-German, and my family just German in that part. And the little girl, the friend, the neighbor, was complaining about all the Ausländer, right? All the foreigners. You could tell she was just adopting her parents' voice, right? And the Ausländer, and she even went so far, as she was 6, she even went so far as to say they stink, right? And I looked at her and said, oh, that's, that I'm an Ausländer, I'm a foreigner. And her mouth dropped, and she didn't know what to do, and she left. She just literally ran out of the yard. And this point about that you're making, of course, from this, from your amazing perspective and all this research that you've done, it's there every day in this, and the way it's ingrained. And that's really something that's stuck with me so much. And then I, grew up a little further and had kids and started going to school. My kids went to integrated schools, and that in Germany means kids with learning needs, special needs, disabilities, all got different kinds of things. They're all together. So it has nothing to do with what anybody looks like or where they come from. It's about their needs in a learning environment. But we also went to a German-American school. So there were Americans and Germans and all different kinds of, and third country folks. And I had was friends with a white German couple, 2 men married, and they adopted 3 Black babies from Chicago. And it was very exciting. And it was also before the rules were changed and that you couldn't bring American kids out of the country, right? So they have these 3 kids. They're not, the 3 children were adopted at different times, have different families, come from different homes. But anyway, it was never, it was not at all strange in our community. It was wonderful. Everybody was super excited. So they go and register the first child at elementary school, the local German elementary school. And the principal of the school says, oh my gosh, he's so adorable. Can I touch his hair? Okay, so, right, so this is really, and I know, Priscilla, you're nodding, but I just wanted to give these 2 examples of, because this section is called Germany Today. This is so relevant. And it is really when people who are, a principal of a school in Berlin to act that way, it's just really sort of shocking. So thank you for bringing this all to our attention from so many different examples in music and theater and art and literature. And this is really wonderful. Okay, so now I'm gonna stop talking. Did you want to?
Oh, no, thanks for your comments, Katie. Yeah, that anecdote about the 6-year-old, that's really a shame. And it just makes me think, I always tell people, my older son is 8 and I buy books, not just about African-American history and stuff, but we have this one book, I love it. It's called This Is How We Do It. And it's got a kid from Russia, a kid from Uganda, from Italy, from I think Iran. And it just, every page is like, this is what I eat for breakfast. This is how I go to school. And so for me, it's really important for him to be exposed to different cultures, and see it as an opportunity, and it's not something to be afraid of. But yeah, what you said about the kids who are adopted, I know a couple in Germany, husband and wife who adopted 2, a brother and sister from Haiti. And they've just had such a difficult time. Like they had to move from Munich to Berlin, hoping that in Berlin it would be less racist, because in Munich people would just walk up and touch their children they wouldn't even ask. But then in Berlin at school they had problems because their son has a learning disability and he was being treated badly. So they actually have now kind of moved it to the country, moved to a small town. But it just shows the struggles. And, and if you're going to adopt Black children in Germany, you have to be prepared. You have to advocate for them to move and find a different school because it's so difficult. Like I did an interview recently with a woman, a professor in Austria who teaches Deutsch als Zweitsprache, so German as a second language. And she was telling me, like, if a kid starts school, 1st grade, and can't speak German, they often are just separated from their class and they, to go to German class. And I was like, but they don't get to meet the kids in their main class, and are they not getting math lessons because they're just doing German all the time? So it's been really interesting to me to hear like how Germany deals with integrating someone new, someone from abroad into the school, into the society, I feel like that a lot of changes could be made to that.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. Thank you. We have so much to talk about today. This is, again, the relevance of today is so apparent. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to, I have the honor of introducing Sylvia Roper and Tracy Ridley. I'm going to start with Sylvia, and your talk is called Seen Not Heard, African Students in East German Newspapers from 1965 to 75. And I know, Sylvia, you've been doing research for a while now on representation in Austria and Germany. So it's wonderful that you could be here today. And you are still a graduate student, almost finished, in the Global History program at the Humboldt University in Berlin, or combined Free and Humboldt universities. This presentation today is composed of primary findings from your MA thesis. Before starting the MA program, you worked as a teacher of English in Hungary, and you also were program assistant to Dr. Bob, right? To Bob Jenkins' Summer Birchfield Research Seminar in Southern, in the Balkans. In 2018, you graduated from UNC with highest distinction in a Bachelor of Arts degree in Political Science and Contemporary European Studies. It's great to have you here. It's great to have you on this side of the Atlantic. And we're looking forward to your presentation. And Tracy, who I am also thrilled to introduce, someone that we've known now for quite a while, since before you even stepped foot on UNC's campus. You are an undergraduate European Studies major and also German minor. And are you still doing political science?
No, that needs to be updated.
I thought so. Okay, none of that. Tracy has managed, I'm diverting a little bit from your bio here. You have managed to study abroad in Korea, one of maybe 6 students who got to go abroad during fall 2020, during the height of the pandemic. Then you went to Mannheim, now you're back, which we are thrilled about, and you plan to go to Lund in Sweden in the fall. And you, of course, were accepted to the Black Europe Summer School, following in Kellen's footsteps, but were unable to go because of COVID. But you have been doing research on Black representation, Black Germans, Black representation in Germany for a while now, and you are getting ready to do a fabulous internship this summer with Bertelsmann and their DEI department. So thank you so much to both of you. Looking forward to your talks.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna try to keep it quick just because I want to make sure Sylvia also has time. So the murder of George Floyd was the shot heard around the world when it comes to racist violence, and more specifically anti-Black racist violence. And we saw this across the world. So people across Europe and everywhere else went to the streets to protest racism, posted Black squares, and conversations began. And this was especially the case in Germany. And Kellen, if you could go to the next slide, please. Oh, there's a slide. There it is. Yeah, that one. And for this slide, I thought, rather than just finding pictures from the many protests that happened all over Germany, that I would include pictures from a Black photographer friend of mine named Lauren Huxtable, who's from Kaiserslautern, but these pictures are actually from the protests in Frankfurt during early July 2020, just to kind of give you an idea that this really was a big thing, and a lot of people were going on the streets at this time in Germany. And up to this point, there had not been an outcry of this level for anti-Black racism in Germany. Priscilla Layne had briefly mentioned the murder of Ori Jallo in 2005, but since then it's kind of been far and few between. But the fact that there was a cell phone video that was spread worldwide, there was no denying it, there was no assuming one thing happened or another. We all saw what happened, and you really had to take it for what it was. And there was kind of this feeling that there was like systemic change on the rise. Nevertheless, we kind of saw with political amnesia that ended very quickly. And while some immediate change has come and it's brought us a bit forward, there are some patterns I've noticed in Germany And Dr. Layne has already brought a couple of them up, but I'll still go into them too, that have kind of held Germany back from making any sustainable progress. So if you go to the next slide, Kellen. So I argue that the blatant disregard for material coming from fields like Black German studies and the omission/censoring of Black voices in Germany is preventing German society from having these productive conversations on anti-Black racism that can lead to systemic change. Kellen, if you can go to the next slide. So as the murder of George Floyd being my reference point, I kind of want to talk about how Germany was, or how racism was discussed in Germany before and how it still kind of is. So it's always brought up as individual cases. So following the regime of the National Socialists, race has always been a sensitive topic in the mainstream, so much so that the German word for race often gives many people goosebumps and shudders just because it brings people back to that time. So when racist acts, big or small, are called out, it's rubbed off or it's described only as a problem that happens in the United States at that kind of level. And so anything less really doesn't equate to that. And I think one of the most widespread versions of this is everyday racism, Alltagsrassismus. So it's these little questions: where are you from? Where are you really from? You speak German well for a Black person. When are you going back? And as you go down the list, it gets more and more sensitive. And people may think that, oh, these are harmless questions. You know, I didn't mean it. It was a mistake. Move on. It's not that big of a deal. But when you ask questions like that, it's questioning someone's natural right to belong to something, to belong to a society, in this case, German society. And many scholars and authors like Alice Hasters, who I will mention later in my presentation, have equated these racial aggressions to mosquito bites that can collect and cause more and more damage that these racial aggressions are. And I prefer the term aggressions over microaggressions because I think that lessens the severity of these racist acts and the problem at hand. Kellen, if you could go to the next slide. Okay, and then Black German studies, it is such a wide encompassing topic and field, and it's really kind of hard to put into one word, but in one sentence, but Priscilla Layne actually wrote an article about how critical race theory and Black German studies can work together. And I think one of her quotes kind of is a perfect summary for what Black German studies can be. So Black studies is about valuing Black experience, history, creativity, and intellectual labor. It's about decolonizing, and I italicized that because I thought that was the most important part of this quote, the mind and challenging Eurocentric white supremacist ideas that are simply based on and glossed over. And then it gives an example when a Black student in Germany is asked to read Kant or Hegel without any conversation about race. So for here, oh, no, not yet. It's really important just to realize that it's not just literature, it's not just anti-racist literature or conversations, it's all encompassing. It has to do with Afro-pessimism and Afrofuturism and just the Black experience in Germany going back centuries, a couple decades, and now. And it doesn't just, while many of these texts and these conversations do involve people's experiences and racist experiences, it's a lot more than that. And I think by including these texts and this content in the discussion of anti-Black racism, it could really kind of set a precedent and historicize what has often been ignored when these conversations come up. Kellen, if you go to the next slide. Oh, not that one. So here are just a couple of the Black German studies contributors and works. So Mayim, she is probably one of the most well-known Black Germans in the field for the book that Layne had also mentioned, Showing Our Colors. And then Sharon Dodua Otu is also a Black British woman who immigrated to Germany and has done a lot of work writing in English and German, as Priscilla Layne has also mentioned, but then there's also Natasha Kelly, she's another important voice. And then Fatima El Tayeb, she's a professor at the University of California, San Diego. Has also written a lot of texts on this topic and just othering in Germany and Europe in general. Each One Teach One Berlin, which also the Afro census, that just gives a more data and depiction of the Black community in Germany in general and the Initiative of Black People in Germany, who not only do a lot of political activism, but also just bring the Black community together in Germany. For example, they have a yearly an annual national meeting where they come and share their experiences and just fellowship. So it's more than just writing text, giving interviews. It really builds up a lot to that. If you could go to the next one, Kellen. And now I'm gonna move over to these discussions lacking representation right after George Floyd. So these are two of the most popular talk shows in Germany, Markus Lanz and Maischberger die Woche. And for Markus Lanz, they're talking about what's happening in the US, all the protests, and even going in depth, or even relating it a little bit back to Germany, but as you can see, there are no Black people included in the conversation. And just kind of going back on you don't have to go back to the previous slide, but the previous slide where I mentioned there are plenty of people doing all of this amazing work, really historicizing and giving examples of what it is to be Black in Germany and the experiences that they have. But they're constantly kept out of these conversations. And also, if you look at Maischberger die Woche, Dr. Layne was a part of this conversation. She's the only Black person on this panel. And she even mentions in herself on Twitter and also in a follow-up interview that there should have been Black Germans included in this conversation. And I think she did, in my opinion, she did an amazing job. And she was very vulnerable and respectful of how she went about the interview. But there should have been Black Germans involved. Especially when you relate it back to you're always pushing it back to the US, and then you talk about it in Germany, there are Black Germans there and they're just constantly being ignored. Their voices are not being shared or given the opportunity to be shared, and that needs to change because they're there. And if we actually want to make any sustainable progress moving forward and really this paradigm shift of thinking about Black people in Germany and how anti-Black racism is perpetuated in Germany, these voices need to be included in the mainstream as well. So Kellen, if you can go to the next slide. And then this is one of the texts that was actually written before the murder of George Floyd, and while it did become relatively popular before his death, I think once it did come out in Germany, it was really one of the moving texts that was out. So it's called What White People Don't Want to Hear About Racism But Should Know. And the author, just to give you a quick background on her, she was born in Cologne to an African-American woman and a white German father. And in this book, she kind of details her life story, but also goes and ties in a lot of critical race theory about growing up as a Black woman in Germany. And it's actually interesting because, and this is the point of the discussion on their terms, when in a podcast, when she was asked about the title of her book, she said, this is actually not what I wanted to title it, but that's what the publishing company wanted, and that's what it needed to get approved. And so these buzzwords and phrases, white people and racism and kind of like calling them out, that's, feeding into capitalism, and it's provocative, and that's what capitalism wants. That's how she's going to be able to sell more books. And it's sad that it has to come that way, that she can't share her story that involves a lot of racial stress, and it can be traumatizing to put the pen to paper. But by her doing that, she has to make a living. It's a multidimensional situation. You can't blame her for trying to share her story and make a living and do it all right. Nothing is ever going to be perfect. And I think there should be this space where Black people in Germany are able to share their stories in their own truth and not have to be boxed in or conform to white supremacy, capitalism, these things that are holding them back and holding us back as a society from making any further progress. And then Kellen, and then while it is, I think there is still so much work to do. I think a lot of progress has been made, and I do want to highlight that. So on the left, you see the street Anton Wilhelm Amo Straße, and this was formerly named Moore Street in Berlin. It was a subway station, and after the murder of George Floyd, they decided to rename after Anton Wilhelm Amo, who was a Black philosopher from Ghana in the 1700s, who came to Germany and was a philosopher and was a professor at a university. And so we see these little steps coming forward in everyday life, because I think that's one of the important things too, is that we're not just having these big scale talks of how is it going to be in 5 years, 10 years, or what does it look like on a global scale. But these little things that we interact with every day of our life are the things that often go unnoticed and that we do need to highlight a little more, or a lot more. And then Ave Tesfaye, she's the first Black woman to be elected to the German Bundestag, so the German Congress, part of the Green Party. And that's also a big step because she is a Black woman in Germany, and she actually came from Eritrea, and she worked her way into, or she worked into becoming a lawyer. And after the murder of 6 people with migration background in 2019 in Hanau by a right-wing extremist, she said, I can't sit on the sidelines anymore. And she decided to get politically involved herself so that she can help make this change for people of color in Germany. And she's truly an inspiration for Black people in Germany. And then just kind of my conclusion that this decolonization, which I had mentioned when I explained what is Black German studies, so just this decolonization of history, literature, society, language in German society and academia. So as we saw by those conversations, there needs to be a more diverse set of voices, Black voices in the conversations, especially the mainstream conversations where a lot of people are watching, and it's not just Black German studies where you have to seek out that knowledge because it is constantly held back from society. And then reckoning with all the German history, the good and the bad. There is so much out there, from the first Black German movement to the Black German movement of the 70s and 80s. And it's becoming more and more accessible as time comes along. It's being translated, it's being shared in more spaces. It just needs to be implemented in these other spaces, in these mainstream spaces at universities in Germany, in the classrooms. It's really important. Then just kind of taking all these things that you learn throughout your day-to-day life, throughout what you learn in the classroom, through the media, and implementing those things that you learn, how to be a better person, how to be more anti-racist into your everyday life. Because while it is great to read 5 or 10 books on the experiences of Black Germans, if you don't actually take something from that and apply it to your own life, it's going to be a lot harder to come any further. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. And Sylvia, you're all lined up to go, and then we're doing questions after, right?
Alrighty, can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Okay, good. Glad to hear it. So I know we're kind of running a bit short on time, so I'm going to try and make mine as concise as possible, I guess. But I just wanted to say that my project draws a lot on Black German studies and the important work that's being done there. My master's degree is in global history, which is a way of approaching history that essentially is trying to lift up marginalized voices and go beyond Eurocentrism. So that has also been a really big inspirer to my project, as well as more recent developments in Cold War scholarship and the field of red globalization, which essentially looks at the interactions between the socialist bloc and the global South, which included many countries, a part of the Third World Movement that started in 1955, essentially trying to claim a rightful place on the world stage and use their agency in important ways. So anyway, that's just a quick theoretical background there. But my thesis, it examines the portrayal of African students during 1965, or from 1965 to 1975 in East German newspapers. And in line with many scholarly works on the GDR and international solidarity that they proclaim to have, I found that there's a very big gap between East German solidarity rhetoric and real existing socialism on the ground. So just a quick background on the German Democratic Republic. Obviously, Germany was partitioned after World War II, and the GDR was kind of seen as a client state for the Soviet occupation forces until it received its sovereignty in 1949. However, most countries saw West Germany or the Federal Republic as the legitimate Germany. So this was profoundly challenging for the German Democratic Republic. And one of the ways that they tried to distinguish themselves was to show themselves as the morally superior or more rightfully Germany, if that makes any sense. So one of the ways they did this was to call themselves an anti-fascist and anti-racist state. They basically blamed all of the Nazi crimes on the West Germans and saw themselves as victims. And this unfortunate evasion of accountability would become kind of a commonplace problem for East Germany, especially in dealing with racism and racist acts, because as I said before, they proclaimed themselves to be anti-racist and basically said no racism exists here, which was completely false. So whenever there was pushback, especially from students from Africa or students of color, basically they would ignore it or they would try and blame the students. So there's a lot of gaslighting there. Okay, so the GDR engaged in the world in a lot of different ways. During the Second Indochina War, during the Korean War, they sent donations, they sent goods. So for example, there was a campaign called Bicycles for Vietnam or Electricity for Vietnam. And this was all done as a means to show that they were the morally superior Germany in a way to gain diplomatic recognition as well, because in 1955, West Germany implemented the Hallstein Doctrine, which essentially said that any state that recognized East Germany as legitimate would no longer have diplomatic ties with West Germany. So this led the East Germany or the GDR to engage in a lot of soft power projects. So student exchanges were one of these. I know this is kind of a lot of background, but I think it's important and necessary. So these student exchanges began in 1951 with 11 students from Nigeria, and they grew until basically 1989, where there were about 10,000 students. Every year there were more and more. And unfortunately for East Germany, I guess this sort of became like almost like a snowball where it got bigger and bigger to the point where they weren't able to support the students accurately or appropriately at times. But many students of color faced racism, they faced discrimination, they faced subpar housing, especially in the beginning of the program. There were like not enough dormitories, so they were overcrowded. Although they received scholarships, most of these students were dispersed around the country and isolated from the East German population. There was also a mismatch between qualifications of these students and the education that they were supposed to receive. So for example, there was a group of doctors in the early Cold War who went to East Germany, and they had already been certified as doctors in their sending countries. And when they got to the GDR, they worked as janitors for a year in a hospital. So massive, profound mismatch of qualifications and training. And unfortunately, interactions between East Germans and these students sometimes led to racist or violent incidents. And as I said before, the state usually responded in gaslighting these students and blaming them instead of the East German behavior. If the East Germans were blamed, it was seen as a byproduct of West German racism or aggression. And there are many limitations placed on these students, especially in marriage. So white German women who wanted to marry, let's say, an African student, was viewed with suspicion. They were seen as, oh, they're just using them as a means to an end to leave Germany. And any student who wanted to stay was treated with suspicion as well, because these students were supposed to be temporary, essentially. So my research focuses on a newspaper analysis of 3 East German newspapers. And essentially I find that while world events are depicted essentially every day and in every issue, it's always through a socialist lens. It's always serving the state, which is, not surprising because of censorship and just the way the media is organized in a socialist country. However, foreign students, especially students of color, were always depicted as a collective. So sometimes their nationalities were not even mentioned. And if they were, their names are rarely ever mentioned. So you never see them as an individual or really as a full human being. Further, these students were rarely ever spoken to. So that's why the title comes in, Seen Not Heard, because whenever their voices were heard, it's very rare and very seldom. And when they were, it was in exceptional circumstances, such as with the assassination of Patrice Lumumba in 1961. After that, a Congolese student was interviewed, but everything that he said or supposedly said was in service to the state, right? So it was always going to be something that would support what the ideology was saying. Additionally, these students were basically always depicted as students, and that might sound like really simplistic, but it just contributes to this one-dimensional manner and how they are portrayed, and unfortunately reinforced how they were supposed to be temporary, basically just passing through, only there for a maximum of a few years. And whenever the students' institutions were discussed, and if anyone was spoken to there, it was always the white German staff or the white German directors who were spoken to instead. So they really were not heard from. And this is important, I think, because as we all know, in this conference, representation is incredibly important. And while you could argue, I guess, that most people in a socialist society are depicted as a collective or are, not treated as individuals, etc., I think is quite different because the white Germans in the society were already kind of de facto integrated into society, whereas when combined with the depictions of these students in the newspapers with how they were treated, clearly with racist intent, discrimination, exclusion, they were not integrated into society. So this just contributed to a narrative othering, unfortunately, for these students, and of exclusion, and this one-dimensional representation was really a dehumanizing way of portraying them, especially because they had such great propagandistic value for the state. They basically were just symbols for most East Germans. Even if they were interacted with, these students were not seen as really human or as parts of society. So yeah, that's basically all I have to say. And I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Well, that's not really all you have to say, but you made it short. Thank you. So we are a little tight on time, but we do want to make sure that you get a chance. So Priscilla has already had to leave, right? Okay. So of course, she's always available to talk with later. And you have her contact information. So please, always continue that dialogue. But can we just maybe take one or two questions for Tracy and Sylvia, and then we'll move on? They'll be sticking around too, so of course we can move on, and you can ask your questions later.
I sent mine in the chat, but I can go ahead and just ask if that's easier.
Yes, please do. Sorry, I was looking right at you and not the chat.
So Sylvia, I'm just curious, what happened to the students that left, and were there any that stayed?
All right, I have to unmute myself. So most of the time, if these students were going to the socialist bloc or to GDR, for example, they were doing so because their countries, because these were mostly from socialist countries, expected them to come back and essentially serve to build up socialism of the ascending country. So they were supposed to be a part of like a socialist elite. And of course, this backfired in a lot of ways. One of the major examples is of Nkrumah's Ghana, where many of these people from Ghana went to the socialist bloc, and then they returned, and Ghana was ousted from power, so they were just kind of unable to find work. But anyway, sorry. So there's some documentation of students who stayed in East Germany, but as time went on, it became a lot harder. There were more bureaucratic hurdles for them to jump through. Some of them would cross the Berlin Wall because they had more mobility than the average East German citizen, and would go to West Germany if they were to stay in Germany at all, or on German soil. But it was very rare for someone to be able to stay, unfortunately. And because they were viewed with suspicion, this meant greater impetus for the Stasi to get involved, for example, in monitoring or surveilling. So most of the time it didn't happen.
Thank you for that, and thank you for your presentation too.